Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the YouTube channel and the podcast. My name is Greg Helbeck, and today I'm going to talk about how do you deal with tenants who owe you money, right? How do you deal with delinquent tenants? How do you do this the right way? How do you avoid conflict if possible? I'm going to hopefully shed some light on this because it happens a lot in the rental business. But before I get into the video and the podcast, if you're not familiar with me, I own 10, almost 11 rental properties. I've been flipping houses and wholesaling homes for 10 years now. I got a lot of experience. I've done over 350 transactions in two difficult markets on the East Coast and West Coast. So everything you're going to hear from me is real world practical information. This is not regurgitated theory out of a book. So if you get value from this video, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening to this on audio, if you can share this with someone else, put it on social media, ideally, that would be great. So let's get into it. How do you deal with delinquent tenants, right? If you're in the landlord business for more than 5 hours, you're going to run into situations where tenants don't pay you rent, right? Whether it's a month-to-month lease or whether it's an annual lease, you're going to have it happen to you. So I just had this happen to me and, it sucks, but it's par for the course. So I'll kind of share the story with you on my situation, and then I'll make the lessons and points pretty obvious, and you can take this and use it in your business. So I moved a tenant into a property in New York, and they didn't have good credit, which was a red flag, and ultimately it bit me in the ass. But they were willing to pay, the market rent price I wanted, and they were willing to put a big deposit down. So I figured might as well go for it. So end up moving the tenant in. They were late on the first payment, which was red flag, but then pretty much the next 10 payments, they were good to go. They paid fairly consistently. And then we got up into the winter. We were in like the chin of January or February, and tenant didn't pay the rent. And I was kind of reaching out to them being like, what's going on? They just completely ghosted me. And I got a message from them like 2 weeks later saying, hey, we're moving out. And I'm like, well, that's great because now I don't have to do an eviction, but you still owe me back rent. We got to figure this out. So I ended up getting an attorney involved. And the thing is, before I actually paid the attorney and like retained them, he told me, he's like, listen, dude, like you're going to pay us like $1,500 and you're going to try to collect $2,000. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I ended up pausing the attorney thing, and they ended up moving out at their own will. It was actually pretty cool. They didn't, make a fuss out of that. Property needed some work, which we currently have the contractor fixing it right now. But they still owe me, some decent amount of money. So at this point, it makes sense to get an attorney involved. So I have my friend who's an attorney, get to send them a simple demand letter saying, you owe my client $2,000, basically pay or else you're going to get sued. And hopefully that demand letter should scare them into paying, which they owe me money. So they got to pay their bills. So that's how we're going to handle it. If they don't pay, we will probably go after them, at least in small claims court, and try to collect that money because, in the business of landlording, you need to keep a good, safe, habitable property, but you also got to get paid. You got to make money. This is not a nonprofit business. So that's how we're going to go about that one. In the meantime, I have a new tenant who's moving into the same property, much more qualified, much more screened. So hopefully the delinquent tenants will be a thing of the past for this property. So number one, when you have a tenant who's not paying the rent, reach out to them and figure out what's going on, right? If they're communicative, they will tell you what's going on, and you can give them a little bit of grace and then hear them out. And the key here is that when they say something, you hold them accountable on what they say. So if they say, Greg, I don't have the rent right now, you'll have the rent next Tuesday, you hold them to the rent being next Tuesday. That's point number one. Point number two, now let's say you reach out to this tenant and then you don't get any communication back from them. They're just completely ghosting you. Now they haven't paid your rent. You still have a lease in place. Then at that point, it's going to make sense to hire an attorney and go for an eviction, depending on where the property is. Now, if you're in a red state, we could do a fast eviction as soon as you possibly can, get the letters out, get the papers out, go for it, right? Because you're going to be able to get them out quickly. Now, if you're in a blue state where it's very tenant friendly, New York, Washington, New Jersey, California, Massachusetts, Illinois, the obvious ones. Now, this is where you got to be careful with sending out eviction letters quickly and incurring legal fees quickly, because what happens is if the tenant's only 2 weeks late and you retain an attorney and then they pay that back rent right away, you just wasted money on an attorney fee, right? So what I normally do is we let the back rent arrear a little bit, right? We let it get to a point to where there's probably a chance they're not going to pay that back. And then it makes sense to actually file an eviction, because now if you build up 2 months worth of back rent, very low chance that tenant's going to pay that back rent, because they're also going to have the new rent coming up. So then when you file for an eviction, you're going to have a good case to actually do the eviction because they're not going to be able to pay you, right? And obviously, I'm not trying to encourage landlords to set their tenants up to fail. Obviously, I wish the best for tenants. I wish they pay the rent, and I wish the landlords keep the places in good condition. However, it will happen where your tenant won't pay you the rent. And if you're in a tenant-friendly state, you have to be strategic on how you do an eviction. Now, before you do that, another thing you could do is you can reach out to the tenant or have an attorney reach out to the tenant and say, listen, we haven't gotten rent in a couple months. We're offering you the one-time opportunity to get out before a certain date, or else we will file an eviction. So you basically offer them the chance to leave and we will waive the back rent. So you're basically saying, surrender the property in exchange for a non-eviction. Or if you're in a really crazy place like New York City, you could say, hey, before we file an eviction, we will pay you $1,000 to just get out of the apartment within 30 days. Another point I want to make before I start to wrap this video up is that you got to be fair with tenants. You got to treat them like humans. Can't be a dirtbag. But at the same time, if you treat your tenants with respect and you follow through on what you say you're going to do by providing clear, clean, safe, fair housing at a reasonable price, and the tenant doesn't hold up to their end of the bargain, you have every right as a landlord to file an eviction and remove them from your property. And there's nothing wrong with that. People do not live for free, right? This is not regarding Section 8. I'm talking about regular, plain Jane tenants. Here's the secret, though. I'm going to give you the secret to never having this happen to you, right? You want the secret here? Screen your tenants. Make sure they're qualified. That's the secret. If you do that, very high chance this will never happen. But what does screening a tenant mean? Number one, do they have a good credit score? If they have a good credit score, they're not going to fuck it up by not paying the rent. I can promise you that. Second thing, good income. If they're making 3 times the rent in income, very low chance they're going to default on their rent. They most likely have savings. And then the third thing is obviously calling references before you move them in. Hey, call the landlord. Call the landlord before that landlord. And if you screen the tenants properly, it is highly unlikely you will run into this. The situation I had, didn't screen the tenant properly. I took a tenant who had bad credit and ultimately they owe me money. Shocker. So hopefully you got value from this. If you are in the New York area, tri-state, Hudson Valley, or Seattle, or Delaware, and you have a house you want to wholesale to me, I will buy it with a bad tenant if the numbers make sense. Or you want to wholesale a house with me on a JV basis, send me an email, greg@velocityhousebuyers.com, or you can send me an Instagram DM at grego37. I'll see you on the next video.